I'm really glad to have you with us, and that you join our second event today. What we want to do is the following. I will quickly introduce you in what is going to happen the next hour, setting some of the ground rules and introducing our guest, Won Jung Byun from UNESCO. Then we get a short introduction in the ESD for 2030 framework to give us a bit of a background and context on what we are talking about today. And from there, we really have the chance what we are actually aiming for, to get into a discussion, into a conversation about what does that ESD for 2030 framework means for us. What is UNESCO planning? How is UNESCO reacting to that huge challenges that the COVID and pandemic situation brings to us and the global educational system? And there you will also have the chance to ask questions and to get involved into the discussion. Caroline, if you now would share the first couple of slides again, then I can quickly introduce everybody into some of the ground rules. So as I said, Won is today with us. I'm really glad that she could make it and that she will give us really expert insights on what is happening right at the moment in UNESCO, how the planning of the ESD for 2030 framework is going on. And I will introduce Won in a second. Before I do that, just some ground rules. Next slide, please. What I would like to ask you in the beginning is if you would just use the chat function and type in from where you are participating and your name, so that everybody gets an idea of not only how many people are there, but from where people are joining us. That would be very helpful and interesting from everybody, I guess. Some of them already started, some of you already started with that. So if you would take that chance, that would be excellent. We also, I want to inform you that we also record that session so that nothing gets lost and that others also would have a chance to watch not only the introduction from Won, but also the discussion as it is working. So this is a recorded session. This is what I wanted to tell you. And to explain how you can participate in our discussion. I have another, next slide, please. Because we don't only have the chat function, but we also have a Q&A button, which you find on the top, on the bottom in the menu. On that Q&A button, you can type in your question, you can submit your question, and we will try to keep as well as possible, we will try to keep track on all the questions asked. There is one more feature that will be very helpful for us. You can also comment on questions and vote on questions. And the more people think that one specific question is important and you vote them up, the more prominent they will appear, and we will try to capture those questions first. So whatever during the introduction or in the discussion, whatever questions come to your mind, please type it into the Q&A session. React to questions from others, and we will try to cover as much of that as possible during our discussion. Next slide, please. So let's get started, and a quick introduction of our guest of today. Today, Ms. Won Jung Byun is with us. Won is currently Senior Project Officer in the section of Education for Sustainable Development at UNESCO Headquarters. And so there she really brings in the expertise and the insights perspective of what is happening right at that moment at UNESCO. One is working at UNESCO, specifically focused on ESD policy, and in particular on the preparation for the new global framework she's going to talk about today, the global framework on ESD for the period 2020 to 2030, and its rollout through its roadmap that still is in the making. One is also the team's focal point on the organization of the upcoming UNESCO World Conference on Education for Sustainable Development, which is, as you might know, is going to happen virtually in May 2021, also this year, and where the global support for the ESD for 2030 framework will be mobilized. Before joining UNESCO, one also worked as executive director for the UNU program, Regional Centers of Expertise, another global network of initiatives to foster education for sustainable development. And she's been responsible for an RCE in South Korea since 2005, and also worked in educational centers in working on ESD in South Korea. So she brings a lot of also practitioners' perspective to the field as well. Always very much dedicating to promoting education for sustainable development, both on the local, national, and international level. And serving during that time, also serving in various committees, including as a regional coordinator for more than 40 RCEs in the Asian Pacific, for example. So one really is an expert on what is happening in ESD. She is a prominent figure when it comes to building the roadmap and the rollout now for the ESD for 2030 framework. And I'm really, really glad that she could make time for us and is here today to discuss what the ESD for 2030 framework actually means for us and how it can help to further build on education for sustainable development, especially in that challenging times of nowadays. So Won, a very warm welcome to you, and I would hand over the floor to you to give an introduction in the ESD for 2030 framework.
Thank you, Matthias, and good afternoon, everybody from Paris. Thanks for this great opportunity. I'm super excited to be here today to introduce you about this new global framework, ESD for 2030, and also the roadmap. And also, since, of course, this roadmap is still in the development, although the roadmap has been published, the content of it has to be still elaborated further in conversation with practitioners and leaders across the world. So I think this will be a perfect moment to have this dialogue with you. So I would like to now put on the screen just to give you a short introduction of the framework. I think the screen should be coming up soon. Yeah, and with the presentation, I would be able to run through the outlines. So before I begin, I would like to take this moment also to extend my gratitude to the organizers, especially Matthias and Deepika, for this kind invitation and the opportunity. So if you could start with the next slide. So as you know, we are building on this moment on all the global efforts that have been taking place around education for sustainable development over the years, which had actually started in the 70s, and also which gained traction through the Rio Earth Summit in the Agenda 21, as well as the UN Decade on ESD between 2005 to 2014. And the most recently, we had the Global Action Program on ESD between 2015 to 2019, which worked mainly focused around the 97 key partners across the world to reach, for example, 37 million learners and 2 million teachers. So some of these numbers are great, and we can certainly build on that. But the more important question now is what we need to do, where are our gaps, and what needs to be done further in order to achieve the goals that we are aiming for, because the window of the opportunity that we have is so small, and it's closing every minute. So every moment counts, and that's why we feel that this ESD for 2030 framework comes in a very important time. Next slide, please. So this also comes in the context of the 17 SDGs in particular. And with the launch of these Sustainable Development Goals in 2005, it brought a renewed emphasis on the role of ESD, as explicitly mentioned in this target 4.7. So this globally agreed target aims to ensure by 2030 that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills to promote sustainable development. Next slide, please. But next slide, please. Yes. But however, this role of ESD does not stop only on the SDG 4 on education. Actually, in 2017, the UN General Assembly resolution recognized ESD as an integral element of Sustainable Development Goals on quality education, SDG 4, but also a key enabler of all the other sustainable goals. So in that regard, this calls for ESD to address the SDGs more concretely and directly, especially with a critical eye. Next slide, please. So in this regard, with all this at the backdrop, UNESCO, as the lead UN agency on ESD, has launched this new global framework on ESD called Education for Sustainable Development Towards Achieving the SDGs, or in short, ESD for 2030, as the follow-up to the Global Action Program. So in the period of 2020 to 2030, this ESD for 2030 framework aims to fully integrate ESD and the 17 SDGs into policies, learning environments, capacity building of educators, empowerment and mobilization of young people, and local level actions. And the roadmap, which was launched last winter, actually underlines the plan of action to implement this framework. Next slide, please. And I would like to today discuss a little bit in depth about these key features of this new framework, namely these three folds: one on the 17 SDGs and education's role, the focus on the big transformation, and the emphasis on member states' leadership. Next slide, please. First of all, the emphasis on education's role for 17 SDGs. While all of ESD work, whether it has any explicit or implicit reference to the SDGs, they are all connected to the achievement of the 17 goals. But ESD also mobilizes action towards the achievement of SDGs through communication and advocacy in education settings. But more importantly, now ESD can promote critical and contextualized understanding of the SDGs by raising questions on interlinkages and tensions among different goals. For example, if economic growth as defined by an increase in per capita GDP is the target of the poverty reduction, it has a negative impact on the goal of reducing CO2 emissions, for example. So this critical analysis may become clearer when learners are able to apply their understanding in their own context, in their school context, local community context, as well as in their country context. And the questions that arise from this process can help learners also to identify opportunities for dialogue, negotiation, and problem solving, which may lead to also concrete action in their own surroundings, and which can in turn then contribute to the achievement of the SDGs. So this critical understandings of the tensions and interlinkages between SDGs will be one of the key important parts for ESD to explore further in the future. Next slide, please. And the second feature is the focus on the big transformation that has been made in this new global framework. ESD in this regard, first part is the transformative action of individuals and how education can provide relevant interventions. So with critical analysis, people may begin to understand the complexities of the realities, the challenges, and how this can be connected to their own lives. So possibly an experiential exposure to the realities can provide deeper connection to their own lives. And with some empathetic connections built, it can lead to a tipping point where it may lead one learner's understanding of the world and into a path of empowerment and action. So in this regard, it is very important that we recognize that ESD in action is basically citizenship in action. Next, please. Yeah. So there are many pedagogical implications of this process of individual transformation that we have to look into. So these components, including knowledge, critical thinking, exposure to realities, empathy, and this moment of solidarity and compassion and action, these all are interconnected with the process of individual transformation. And in this regard, it is important not only to look into the formal education, but also non-formal and informal education as a lifelong learning process. Secondly, it is also important not only to look into cognitive, but also social, emotional, and behavioral learning dimensions to make sure that these elements are well embedded and balanced out within the curriculum and the teaching practices on the ground. And thirdly, the importance of community and citizenship education is key, because individuals' relevance, their recognition of the relevance of these issues, big issues like climate change, with their own personal futures, that will be the key element that brings and inspires people to take action. So in this regard, ESD can employ learning content, pedagogy, and learning environment that promotes transformative actions of individual learners. Next slide, please. And second part of this big transformation is more structural. So structural changes, what is needed in order for individual actions that are intertwined with the structural structures of our society, how that came to aim to transform the deep causes of the crisis that we face today. So ESD for 2030 framework recognizes that there is a need for ESD to focus more on deep structural causes and the relationship between economic growth and sustainable development, and to encourage learners to explore values which could provide an alternative, and to make sure that people are empowered to engage directly in the political processes as political agents. Next slide, please. So in this regard, this means that ESD has to place far more emphasis on structural causes of the sustainability problems, raise questions on systemic issues. And at the heart of this lies the question of rethinking and reimagining the economic models. During the development period of the framework, we explored with various experts from different disciplines on how the values such as that of conservation, sufficiency, moderation, solidarity, that are connected to the traditional knowledge and social cultural context in different parts of the world are being promoted as antidotes to the never-ending neoliberal growth model. So as ESD in action is citizenship in action, as mentioned in the framework, this also means that learners are encouraged to raise questions such as economic growth for whom and for what ends, and take actions as citizens to ensure that the economy is organized around the needs of humans within the ecological boundaries rather than for its own sake. So this perspective on structural issues makes ESD more relevant also in the context of poverty, because so far we have to recognize that ESD or environmental education has been viewed often as a luxury topic for the wealthier countries. But with the climate crisis and disproportionate impact on people, as well as the question of structural causes, this brings ESD to focus more on the relevant life skills for sustainable livelihood and the right of people to live decently. This connects well, I think, to the first dialogue with Hela of this ISDL series as well. Next slide, please. So in this regard, there's a third element also on the big transformation of which is related to the technological advancements. I think the slide is slightly off, but no problem. So in this regard, I think one of the issues that we have to not forget at this point in the history is to recognize the development of technologies and how they are perhaps creating and resolving some of the old problems, for example, of making sure that energy is saved and others are and the water tap is turned off. But new challenges may well arise because of the technological advances. And this is also very much connected to the learning that we promote through ESD, because ESD can accelerate the transition to green technologies, but also ironically, technologies may create the illusion that technology can solve all problems of sustainability. So in this regard, the importance of critical thinking to promote sustainability would be much more important. Next slide, please. So solutions for old problems, but also new problems caused by these solutions, and the illusions that the problems may have been solved all by technology. These are all now the questions that are connected to ESD's work. For example, changing our energy source to renewable is only one part of the solution. When I was working in Korea, there were projects to support the creation of energy independent villages, which generate 100% of the energy consumed from solar power and other renewable sources. So people were very happy that their energy bill was reduced to almost nothing, that they were contributing to the environment. But however, over time, one visible side effect was noted, that people began to buy bigger and higher energy consuming TVs and refrigerators because their energy bill was so low. And they felt that somehow with renewable sources, that there's no need for us to be concerned about the environment impact any further. So with the discussions on green deals going on in many countries across the world, we have to note that technology also requires finite resources to deliver, and review the implications and possible illusions with critical eyes. Next slide, please. And the urgency of the existential crisis also calls for stronger leadership and ownership of the member states. So in this regard, this ESD for 2030 framework focuses on country initiative through which countries can address the 5 priority action areas of ESD, engage all learners and stakeholders, and advocate and mobilize resources towards mainstreaming ESD in their education and sustainability policies. So UNESCO invites all member states to launch their country initiative building on their existing work on ESD. And this should be aligned with UNESCO's global priorities on Africa, gender equality, with a particular emphasis on small island developing states. Next slide, please. Now, what should we now specifically do to promote these 17 SDGs, the big individual and societal transformation and country leadership? So during the consultation to develop ESD for 2030 framework, we have asked multiple ESD stakeholders, and they have called for continued investments around the 5 priority action areas that have been in place since the period of the Global Action Program, namely one on advancing policy, transforming learning environments, building capacities of educators, mobilizing youth, and accelerating local level action. And all of this actually requires multi-stakeholder approach as the key to its success. And it's all interlinked and intertwined into one big goal of achieving the SDGs. Next slide, please. And in terms of the implementation, there are 6 elements to the implementation strategy of the roadmap. First, at the heart of the implementation is what we call country initiative on ESD for 2030. All UNESCO member states are invited to launch their own country initiative to mainstream ESD in their education and sustainable development policies and practices. So this will be at the heart of it. And then the next part is on the inclusive network of partners that we would like to call ESDnet at global and regional levels, which will invite the representatives of country initiatives as well as other ESD actors from education and sustainable development communities. Third part is the communication and advocacy efforts during the, including, for example, the promotion of the SDGs as well as the UNESCO Japan ESD Prize. And evidence-informed implementation of the framework would be important. And this promotion of relevant research will be one of the key components of the implementation. Mobilizing resources through making full use of the multidisciplinary nature of UNESCO as well as its partners. And finally, the various efforts to monitor the progress will be pursued with the aim of achieving the SDG target 4.7. Next slide, please. In particular, the key component of country initiative deserves a little bit more elaboration, because it's like we call it as if creating a big basket of ESD efforts and different ongoing activities that are done in sustainability activities, both from education and sustainable development sectors. and creating a basket that puts all these efforts together, bring them together to build on the ongoing efforts, engage them in a multi-stakeholder dialogue, making sure that we create connections and also synergies between different efforts. This would be the core element and approach of the country initiative. And UNESCO stands ready to support technically for the countries to help them mobilize these preparatory stages of the multi-stakeholder approach. And also with this groups of the country initiative through ESD Global Network, there will be opportunities for networking and dialogues among the countries who are working on this country initiative as well. Next slide, please. Finally, on the big time frames on what happens next, 2020 to 2021 has been the period of building the momentum phase with the postponement of the UNESCO World Conference to 17th to 19 May. And in the meantime, we didn't want to lose time. So already since the end of last year, when the roadmap was launched, there has been discussions with various countries who are willing to launch their country initiative already before Berlin. So we do hope to see more and more countries join in this country initiative in the coming months and years. And then by 2025, we will hope to have a midterm review of the framework, and 2030, the final review of the framework. And in the period of the next 10 years, we will plan to organize regional meetings of ESD for 2030, hopefully the first one in 2022 as a physical meeting, especially if possible back-to-back to regional SDG 4 meetings, so that ESD can be more highlighted and mainstreamed in the SDG 4 discussions on education policies. And then the global ESD net meeting is planned every 2 years. And so since in 2021, we'll have the UNESCO World Conference, the next global meeting will be in 2023 with a cycle of every 2 years until 2030. So these are the big time frame that we have for the future. And finally, with a few words that I think summarizes this discussion and all the essence of the framework quite well from our Assistant Director General of UNESCO, that we are increasingly asking if what people learn is truly relevant for their lives, and if what they learn helps to ensure the survival of our planet. So ESD indeed is there to provide the knowledge, awareness, and action that empower people to transform themselves and transform the society. So I would like to emphasize that ESD is no longer a feel-good, care for the nature type of topic at the margins of education policy. It should be at the heart and hands as well as the heads of the learners as the key to our own survival and in the next few years that we have to spare. So there's simply no time to lose and possibly no second chance. So I think it's so very, very important that we try to bring attention and action around ESD for 2030 at this moment. So with this, I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention. And if you have any questions, please please feel free to contact me. And there are some links here also available for your information. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Won. That was a wonderful introduction and lots of food for thought to catch up with what is going on and what UNESCO is planning right at the moment. So thank you very much for that. And I would like to take the chance to start our discussion with a couple of questions around issues which you raised in here as well. I just want to re-emphasize, if you have questions, and I see Manoa already putting forward the first one. So if you want to raise questions, use the Q&A button and put your questions in there, comment on questions for others, and we try to capture them as well as we can during our discussion. So thank you very much again for that introduction. And maybe let's start. I really liked what you said in terms of emphasizing the role of critical thinking and enabling the learner. I think this is a shift that also happened over the last years. We all know that, sometimes too simplistic instrumental perspective on behavior change, such, educating towards that they better do things right, is sort of fading out, and it's really emphasizing that we need that thinking outside the box, critical thinking, and also, and you rightfully mentioned that, also understanding potential contradictions in between the SDGs, for example. Let me come back to your time frame and sort of the overall vision for a 2030, and maybe, as you said, that ESD is rethinking and reimagination of what could be there and how we want to build our society and our world. Could you paint me a bit of the picture of how you, either individually or you as a representative of UNESCO, how would you see ESD implemented in 2030 to call that period as successful? What would you hope? What would the picture look like? How ESD became sort of business as usual or something else in 2030?
Thanks, Matthias. That's a very, very big and challenging question, and it's a very provocative question for me to also reflect on the aims and goals of what we're doing. But at the same time, I would like to turn it around that, of course, seeing ESD at the heart of education policy would be very, very rewarding and important. And the efforts around that is already taking place, for example, with countries like Italy putting climate change education as mandatory in their education policies for all levels of learners. So those kind of things are happening, and we would like to see that in the majority of the countries already in place by 2030. And that indeed is one of the aims of the country initiative, to make sure that we push each other to advance. But at the same time, I would like to say that I recently learned that a student of mine, long-time student of mine, with whom I met when she was 17, she was very interested in ESD and took a lot of actions around that. And now I recently learned that she became the head of the Green Party in Korea. So those kind of things I would like to see already, and it's already happening. We don't need to wait until 2030. Those kind of engagements and actions and new imaginations coming from people. I think with that, at the same time, while we aim for these countries to embrace ESD in the education policies, at the same time as the end goal, the picture that we can imagine, I think we can't imagine that at this point, because we have to rethink everything that has built the current problems, current crisis. So rethinking that, deconstructing what we have now, requires a lot of reimagination and rethinking. So at the same time, I don't think I have the capacity to imagine the future in a clearer picture now.
That is already very helpful. So I think that gives sort of the pathway and direction on what is going on there. And maybe something that does connect to some of the questions that already come into the Q&A session is, you also raised that challenge of ESD in poor countries, and to make it really something that is an global endeavor and not sort of some sort of elite activities that just come on top, but it is really tackling basic education and quality education at heart. How can UNESCO, and here I refer to questions that have been raised, how can UNESCO support that, given also these huge challenges in, basic skills and basic education in so many countries?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a very good question. And our pursuit of course, the basic education and quality education goes hand in hand, and we can no longer only focus on either one. It's two sides of the same coin, and it has to be pursued together. And at the same time, in terms of the quality education, the relevance of education to the realities that learners face would be really important at the heart of quality education. And in that regard, in context of extreme poverty, the relevance of what they learn in schools has to connect with the realities, for example, of this disproportionate impact of climate change and how it affects the learners, prevents them from going to school, as well as also the economic and historic structures that we have also witnessed in a number of countries that we reviewed while developing the framework. So this connection, relevance of education is very much at the heart of also making sure that education at all it becomes meaningful in this day of mobile learning and information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So to continue that thought, or to further develop that thought, we now, I mean, we do see these challenges which we have to implement ESD more fully in the time frame anyway, and that was long known, and we build up to that. Now we are facing, for the last 13 months, we are facing something, a very new situation, new challenges, and obviously no conversation these days without, mentioning the pandemic situation and the coronavirus. And here, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Tempa also raised the question of, could you tell us something about, is there anything like a best practice or approach or experiences of UNESCO in implementing ESD also during and post the Corona situation? So how did that change what UNESCO is planning, and are there sort of other examples where we could look at where we see sort of best, maybe not best practice, but good practice of how to continue that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed, this came up especially at the beginning of the pandemic last year, when we thought that perhaps ESD is more relevant in a face-to-face type of physical environment where learners can actually have experiential learning taking place in connection with other people. But then when we were all now confined to our individual living rooms, trying to still manage education activities, nevertheless, that question of how could the question of just simply learning about factual knowledge versus continuing ESD in these settings were quite different. And so that's why we had a series of online workshops going on since September until next month, April, ahead of the Berlin conference. And one of the topics raised there was this the possibility whether or not ESD can be done in distant and remote learning settings. And one of the interesting practices actually we saw from different examples across the world was, of course, the use of mobile phones as well as internet and other sources. But at the same time, in countries like Peru, we had a speaker from this center that promotes Amazon conservation and education around Amazon conservation. He was mentioning how they used radios in order to promote their programs. And for them, it actually helped them to reach a much wider audience than they would usually do in face-to-face physical visits to the center. So he was mentioning how it became available for them to connect with the learners who are based in these smaller villages in the Amazon through radio, and how that enabled also for the learners who live in the big cities to get a more direct sense of connection with them. So in these kind of examples, we could see that while it has been a big challenge, many of the educators have and learners have come up with very innovative and diverse ways of overcoming this, including, for example, ranging from mobile phones, but also with virtual realities and other super high-tech approaches. So indeed, it was quite possible to promote ESD nevertheless in this context, but the importance of social emotional learning and some sort of action element component of ESD was still important. So even while you're confined in your living room, the children found it very happy to, for example, go out to their backyard and observe things that happen around them and take recordings of them, rather than just sitting down and reading and following internet courses. So these social, emotional, and behavioral aspects became quite important. And in overall, in the approaches of ESD after COVID and the lessons learned from the COVID, I think as we all recognize, I think we all felt that the importance, how shockingly we are interconnected with each other. This sense of interconnection, I think, made it more relevant for us to talk about ESD and sustainability and our interconnection with the nature, our interconnection between humans. And also same time, we realized that like in the reaction to the pandemic, if we don't take action at the right moment, if we become a bit too late, then things would fall down. So that same analogy can be made for the climate crisis and how important it is to act in the right moment before it becomes too late. And also at the same time, we could see a little bit of hope in the sense that massive change is possible when we decide to do it. And, and extreme measures like lockdown now seems like a mundane policy measure. So it does give us a little bit of hope that if we really try to put our efforts on this, tackling issues like climate change and promoting ESD, mainstreaming it at the heart of education policies, it can happen. We just need to make a decision for it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you very much. So there are two follow-up questions, basically, which I think are super important, and I try to cover them one by one. The first is has been raised by Thomas Hoffmann, and it's taking up on what you already mentioned. So we see something, so sort of two trends that might be perceived as somehow contradictory. One is that what you also said, that need to go out to explore your surrounding, your environment, something what we discuss under place-based education and regionalized, contextualized approaches, which is very important. And then often when we talk about mainstreaming, we have that global perspective and somehow unified perspective, and we need these global connections. I think we as humans, to understand the challenges ahead of us, we need to also connect globally, but we need this regional context as well. How do you see, or how is that discussed within UNESCO and the UNESCO framework? How does that come together nicely or contradict each other? And what is the importance of sort of regional contextualized lifestyles, approaches on the one side and the global connection on the other side?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and in fact, at the heart of this relevance of education is the issue of context and the relevance of what they learn, what people learn, and how they respond and act on it with regards to the context, the local context that you live in, as well as the global context. So I think in terms of the connections, it is directly linked with the local context where people find their meaning of life, where they find connections and also reaffirmation from the peers in living in the community, and how it can connect to reinforce the learnings that you had through your school activities or whatever learning sources that you have. So reinforcing and making relevance, making meaning within your community is very important at the heart of ESD. And that in turn will be the basis for empowerment and action as a follow-up. So for example, taking political action as a citizen within your community to raise your voice, etc., would be most relevant. But at the same time, I don't think there's rather a contradiction in terms of the approaches of the importance of global context, but rather it has all connections with each other to make this relevance of local context much more meaningful in terms of the flow of this sustainability issues around the globe. Because we living in a small city, small villages, we are all connected with and affected by the global issues that surrounds us. So in a way, while we look for relevance in our local communities, that naturally is in connection with the global context and its impact. But at the same time, I would like to emphasize that this ESD for 2030 framework, one of the new aspects that is introduced in the framework is the issue of the structural changes. And so this global context and the structural issues that actually causes or influences our daily lives in local context, that has to be understood and well translated and deconstructed in order for us to make sense of what is happening in our local context, and also for us to enable and make a decision about our follow-up actions. So that whole structural change issue, I think, is connected more closely with the global context.
Thank you very much. And this nicely connects to another, and you might have partly answered that already, because now you're with that sort of structural changes as an ongoing process. You're talking about something that we already learned throughout the time being involved in ESD. Daniel, our colleague Daniel Fischer, raises exactly the question, coming back to your last slide, where you nicely sort of summarized the importance and emphasized that that learning should be truly relevant for us. And what Daniel is asking is, what, given that we have the decade, we have the global action plan, so there is already quite a learning pathway for us. What is that? What did we learn? What did UNESCO learn in that process? That is, what is truly relevant? What is sort of some of the key learnings we had along the time when it comes to further implementing ESD?
Indeed. So when we were preparing for this new framework, we did look into the lessons learned through by, for example, going into consultation processes with our key partners and key stakeholders. And one of the conclusions that came out of this process was that indeed we did make some good achievements. The numbers were quite impressive. We were able to reach, and there are more and more countries becoming interested in ESD or putting ESD more at the heart of their education policies. So indeed, we have seen some achievements and successes. And also we have seen, especially through the UN decade, we've seen a lot of good practices rising up in different parts of the world. So individual project level, good practices are all there. But now the question in this new era for many of our stakeholders was the question of how do we put this at the mainstream of education policies? It should not be some additional element that nicely decorates the education work, but it has to be at the heart of it, because it now questions everything that has built our societies, questioning from the way that we have chosen, what are our core values and principles our societies have chosen to promote in education systems, and how are we doing in terms of putting that into action and promoting it among the learners. So by placing this at the heart of education policies, things will look quite different, the landscape in the future. And that is what the stakeholders have been asking for us to do as a lesson learned. It has to be at the heart. It has to be mainstream. It has to lead the discussions on the purpose of education and the content and the pedagogies of education policies.
Thank you very much. So maybe this is a bit of a change of the topic, but something that I think is very important, and that is a question Pandelani raised, which I have to admit concerns me also a lot. So if we look into what is coming in the next years and another sort of learning that the pandemic situation brought to us as well, that it's not only a movement towards contextualized regional approaches as well, but we see when it comes to politics, to collaboration approaches, we see a lot of inequalities coming up now with the pandemic situation again. We see national approaches. We see, with the vaccine discussion, we see our country first movements in many areas of the world, which is quite troublesome. How do you see that sort of contradicting the global movement towards ESD, and how can ESD contribute in overcoming these inequalities?
Mm-hmm. That's a very important question, and I think that's at the heart of also this structural change element of the framework, because we have seen how the current economic models have produced the current inequalities and injustices around the world, and how it has impacted not only in terms of the human development and issues of livelihoods of individuals, but also how it has impacted the environment and also contributed to the climate crisis. So in that regard, I think inequality comes in hand with the question of climate emergency and how we respond to that through ESD. And at the end of the day, we have to make sure and raise the question of the purpose of our actions. Why, for whom are we doing these activities, economic activities, and for what purpose? In that regard, I think inequality and raising of the questions, critical thinking and critical questions around these structural issues that ESD would like to now promote, it also would contribute to the inequalities questions. And that very much is in connection with all the other different environmental issues, for example, climate refugees and other other issues. And in terms of the nationalism and how we are now shutting the borders down, trying to make sure that we, in a smaller group of the societies, try to survive in this pandemic, I think I do hope that this is a temporary phenomenon that we can overcome. Because while we do see this in terms of the vaccine distribution and some of these travel restrictions, at the same time, one of the key learnings that we had from the pandemic was this interconnectedness. We realized that not only can we as a country block our doors and shut down to live happily on our own, everything, including, for example, the distribution of masks, the materials that make our masks, all of these are coming from different countries. And we did not realize how much we are dependent on others until this point, I think. So we are much more dependent on others than we thought. And this sense of interconnection, I think, would need to be further explored and encouraged in order for us to really come out of this pandemic with good lessons to build back better rather than going to the opposite direction of protectionism and nationalism.
Yeah, thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. So now we talked a lot, and sorry if I sometimes gave you a hard time or giving you hard questions. We talked a lot about what UNESCO can do and the role of UNESCO, which is very important in putting forward the ESD agenda. And I'm extremely grateful for the insights you shared with us. Maybe now I can turn tables a bit, because you also, in the implementation, you had like 6 aspects of implementation you outlined in your presentation. And one of them was the importance of tracking issues and trends. And this is something we in our institute, for example, how we might contribute as well. So this is, we try to contribute with, not only raising awareness, bringing people together in such conversation formats like today, but we try to contribute with research and creating evidence. So what would, from your perspective, from UNESCO, what would be your sort of what would you are hoping for, or what would you are expecting from participants in the ESD discourse, like our institute? What would you hope to see in terms of issues and trends that are tracked, or research that is produced within the next couple of years? What do you think is important there?
That's a very, very good question, and I would love to hear your thoughts also on the way forward. But at the moment, the idea is for us, because UNESCO as such is not a research-oriented institution, but at the same time, what we can do through our convening role could connect with the practices and build stronger bridges between the research and practice, the world of the practitioners. So in that regard, for example, this biannual meetings of ESD network, we are planning to organize it as a learning opportunity so that we can not only bring together different stakeholders who are implementing to share good practices, but also bring together some of the cutting edge research outputs that can also enlighten and raise questions for the practitioners on the ground in country initiatives, as well as at regional and global level. So this building of the bridge, we thought, would be one important aspect that UNESCO can contribute. So in that regard, we do hope to see more of the active involvement of the research communities in these platforms. And in the phase of the every 2 years, we would like to also invite, and there will be a process launched after Berlin, to invite for some of the key questions that need to be addressed, or that could be interesting to be addressed during this period of the next 2 years. For example, it could be a question that is also proposed by the researchers themselves, but also the questions that the countries or practitioners are eager to find out more about. So there we will be creating an online platform through which we will invite these questions to be compiled, and some of the core questions will be selected and put there for anyone in the research community to be able to respond. And if indeed, if you're interested to join in and launch interesting research activities around that, and then as the result in 2 years' time, the outcomes, knowledge products can be presented in this global meeting. So there should be more conversation and bridging between the worlds, and through this ESD for 2030 framework, we hope to do that as well.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, this is for you. That is something that we will be happy to contribute to as well. And I think where the exchange is very important. And I mean, UNESCO did already, did support that sort of exchange widely with lots of initiatives. And I mean, we are part, for example, of a UniTwin network with other UNESCO chairs, where we exchange on how to move forward the teacher education for sustainable development agenda. And I clearly see some of the questions that we will, that will concern us for over the next couple of years. Mm-hmm. I took notes as you emphasized that sort of the role of enabling students, learners as critical thinkers. And I think, to conceptualize that a bit more, so that it's not just a buzzword. I mean, we all would agree that critical thinkers, I mean, how could that not be a good thing? But what does it actually mean? And this is where research comes into play, right? So that we better understand how we best support such critical thinking. How can we measure something like that? How can we best design learning to make sort of the development of such critical skills or skills of critical thinking really as good as possible. So that is something that concerns us as well. We've been lately looking a lot into competencies that teachers need to actually create teaching and learning environments for ESD. I think that is something, we need to implement that into the higher education, teacher education system, for example. But therefore, we also need to know what other than content do we integrate. So what does a teacher need to be able, to enable students to become critical thinkers? I think that's not as trivial as it might sound for some. And this is where we try to, what a lot of our research is around, and especially what is the beauty in our institute, I think, is that we are not teacher education, something very much sort of in the informal education sector. But here in our institute, we focus on transdisciplinary learning. So learning outside in informal settings as well. And, together with practitioners from different backgrounds in what we call real world laboratories, to make it really meaningful and to really contextualize learning. And I think this is where we also, with insights and with creating evidence on what works or what works not, we can also help to then, inform implementation activities to then mainstream what we learned is a successful approach in some cases.
Indeed, indeed.
Okay, I see we are this hour always is going over so quickly. We are already a bit in over time. I just want to try to capture if I missed something important on the questions. We might want to come back to one or three of them in the aftermath. But I really want to thank you that you took the time. That was wonderful. If I look into the chat, many people have been very grateful on the insights that you shared. They very much thank you for the discussion. For me, it is only to point out, there are different ways, and you see that on the slide, to follow our activities, what we do in our research. I warmly welcome you to register for our newsletter update if you want to be informed with next such sessions, to get other such wonderful colleagues as Won in conversation. We want to have that series, something that came out of the sort of post-corona situation as well, where it informed, okay, we still, even if you're locked back at home, we still can connect on a global level, and it's great to see so many colleagues and interested people here. So we are planning for the 22nd of April with our next session. We will inform you soon as soon that this is confirmed. And once again, very warm welcome. Thank you to you for taking your time and having that conversation. That was a pleasure for me.
Thank you so much for inviting me for this wonderful dialogue, and I really enjoyed it. And thanks a lot for all the colleagues in the room who showed interest and support for the ESD for 2030 framework. So we look forward to working with you very closely in the coming years, and hopefully also around the UNESCO World Conference in May and beyond. So thanks a lot, and hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you. And thanks to all the participants for your very insightful questions. And I hope to see you next time in about a month for our next session of this series. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Won. Thank you very much.